your lecture notes. So when we talk about a cycle, and obviously we can start within that cycle at any given point. But we typically start with the heart at rest. Okay? So that means both the atria and the ventricles are relaxed. And so we start out with the ECG as a straight line. Okay? So both the ventricles and the atria are relaxed, so neither set of ventricular muscles, cells, are undergoing depolarization. And during this time, because the pressure is higher in the atria than it is in the ventricles, both the atrioventricular valves are open and blood is continually flowing into the ventricles. So we're on the far left of the diagram, just slightly before the SA node fires. And at this time, we would have atrioventricular valves are open. And we have what's known as ventricular filling. Okay, while the heart is at rest, blood is continuing to flow into the ventricles. Then the SA node fires. Okay, and the SA node is what type of cell? Formed of what type of cells? Autorhythmic or contractile? Autorhythmic. All right. So when the SA node fires, that current created by the action potentials reached by the SA node gets to the atrial contractile cells and through the gap junctions that we talked about on Tuesday, and that causes a wave of depolarization through the atrial contractile cells. And that appears on our ECG as our P wave. So, what triggers this? Atrial depolarization, and what causes atrial depolarization to occur? The original source of that current is the action potentials of the SA node. Okay? So looking at the SA node, looking at the autorhythmic cells, what would be happening in the autorhythmic cells at this time? Prior to here.
Depolarization.
Depolarization. What types of channels are going to be open? Voltage gated or leaky? Leaky. Both sodium and potassium leaky channels will be open, but the autorhythmic cells are more permeable to sodium or potassium? Sodium, okay? So during this time, we're seeing leaky sodium channels forming a graded potential. That reaches threshold and creates an action potential. Okay? And as the autorhythmic cells of the SA node reaches action potential, that current created by the action potential of the autorhythmic cells passes through gap junctions to the contractile cells of the atria. And the contractile cells of the atria, which have been at a resting membrane potential, are going to reach their action potential. And these would be the atrial contractile cells. And as we see, and we'll put autorhythmic cells here. So the wave, the P wave, is occurring as successive contractile cells of the atria undergo depolarization. And that wave of depolarization through the atria is what's causing the P wave. Everybody with me so far? Okay, this is Tuesday's lecture. You're not going to learn maybe a couple of new words, but no new concepts today. We're just going to be putting it together. All right? So you can see down at the bottom here, the P wave occurring as the current flows through the atria. Then our ECG, and remember this is relationship of current in the heart to the skin, not an electrode inside a single muscle cell compared to outside interstitial fluid that we're looking at here. Question?
Yeah, what's the TP?
The TP is threshold potential. Okay. All right, so then we have a short period of time in which the current is traveling through the autorhythmic cells forming the AV bundle and the bundle branches and the conduction or Purkinje myofibers. All right, and then it reaches the ventricular contractile cells. And through gap junctions, creates a wave of depolarization through the ventricular contractile cells. And so we see that occurring. Now this is showing just one. All right, so a wave of them would be occurring. And that results in the occurrence of our ECG as a QRS wave. Okay? And whoops, I can draw another straight line than that. And then with repolarization, we see the T wave. Now the heart is back to relaxation. Both of the atria is repolarized, and that's going to occur during this period of time, so we don't see repolarization of autorhythmic of contractile cells because of the QRS. And now the heart is at rest again. So we have another period of relaxation and ventricular filling. Now, what are the autorhythmic cells doing during that time? As soon as they have their action potential, do they go into a resting membrane potential, or do they start to depolarize again? They start to depolarize again. So we see this again. So as soon as this reaches threshold, let's see where my slightly higher than it was. As soon as this reaches threshold, we form an action potential again, and that causes the atrial contractile cells to form another depolarization, and we see another P wave. So remember I was talking about on Tuesday that every time we see an action potential at our SA node, that's followed by causes the P wave, and when it reaches the ventricles, causes the QRS wave, right? So that's what we mean by pacemaker. If the SA node depolarizes 70 times a minute, we're going to see 70 P waves and 70 QRS waves and have 70 heartbeats. Okay? So this is what's happening electrically at the autorhythmic cell and contractile cell molecular level, as far as having an electrode inside the cell and comparing its current to outside the cell. Now when we look at our diagram of the cardiac cycle, it won't have this on it, it will have just the ECG. So I'll leave that diagram up there. But I wanted to reflect back to our content from Tuesday's lecture so that you had an understanding of what's happening to the autorhythmic cells. So the P wave is due to the action potential of the autorhythmic cells reaching the atrial cells. Autorhythmic cells fire, and then we will not have another P wave until the SA autorhythmic cells reach threshold again. So the effect of the SA node is to cause more calcium ions to come into the cells, and therefore we might reach our threshold here, and therefore we would have another P wave here instead of down the line. Yes?
Are the autorhythmic and the contractile cells like integrated in the heart, or they're in specific?
No, the autorhythmic cells form our SA node, our AV node, our AV bundle, our bundle branches. So the SA node depolarizes at a faster rate than the others, so that's why it's called the pacemaker. And so what's causing this rate, since we're looking at a normal heart here, would be the SA nodal cells or the autorhythmic cells in the SA node.
Okay,
So when
the
they
branches-
reach threshold and fire, they create a current that then passes into the atrial contractile cells, gets cell by cell, spreading across, because remember they're joined, the branches are joined by gap junctions. So that current, originally formed in the autorhythmic cells, passes through and depolarizes and creates a continuing current in the contractile cells, and that continuing current passes to the next cell via gap junctions. So as it passes through the atria, it causes the P wave to be formed. Okay? And then it reaches the ventricles, it causes the QRS wave to be formed. So that's why I drew the atrial contractile action potential here with the P wave, because it's that formation of the atrial contractile depolarization that is actually causing the P wave. The P wave is not caused by the action potential in the autorhythmic cell, it's caused by the action potential in the contractile cells. Okay, and then it reaches the ventricles, and series after series, it's not one cell, but the whole ventricle going through ventricular depolarization that results in the QRS wave. And again, this is not showing depolarization and repolarization, it's showing the atria depolarizing in a wave in relationship to what the current is in the skin. So it's not the same as we're seeing, this is one individual cell change. Okay? So you can see that passing through, and then the T wave is when, as a series, the ventricular contractile cells repolarize, and then we get back into the resting heart rate, or the heart at rest without the atria or ventricles contracting. All right, so we can start this cycle anywhere, but we tend to start it with the beginning of our P wave. Okay? So, this is what we're going to be looking at in the major component of today's lecture is these series of pressure changes and what happens to the valves during this entire cycle. So which of these events will occur when aortic pressure is greater than ventricular pressure? At the time. So at the single time that aortic pressure becomes greater than ventricular pressure, what will happen?
Do we have actual potential?
No? What are these events? So, aortic pressure is greater than ventricular pressure. What will happen? Are we talking about semilunar valves, or are we talking about atrioventricular valves? Is there an atrioventricular valve between the aorta and the ventricle? Atrioventricular valves are between the atrium and the ventricle. What's between the aorta and the ventricle? Semilunar valves. So when aortic pressure becomes greater than ventricular pressure, it's the semilunar valves that are going to be affected. Aortic pressure has no effect on the AV valves. All right, so when aortic pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, what's going to happen to the semilunar valves? Are they going to close or open?
Open. Because they're pumping.
Okay, think about your C chart. Which direction are the semilunar valves facing? This way or this way? This way. All right, so when aortic pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, is the blood flow going to go from aorta to ventricle or away from the ventricle? When aortic pressure, here's the aorta, here's the ventricle. Pressure in the aorta is greater than it is in the ventricle. So is blood going to go this direction, or is blood going to go this direction? It's going to go down. And when it goes down, is it going to fill those valves up with blood, or is it going to push them towards the sides of the vessel? When it's going down. If our valves are oriented like this,
They're gonna like.
Is it going to fill those valves up with blood and have them go like this, or is it going to press them to the sides of the aorta as the blood flows towards the ventricles?
It's gonna fill them up close.
Gonna fill them up with blood, and they're going to go like that and close. Does that make sense? If not, let me diagram it on the board. Okay. So here's the aorta. Here's the semilunar valves, or two cusps of them. When pressure in the ventricle is greater than pressure in the aorta, it's going to go from ventricle to aorta. So it's going to go in this direction, and it's going to cause the semilunar valve to get opened and pushed up against the aortic wall. That's ventricular pressure greater than aortic pressure, all right? Now, when aortic pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, flow is going to be in the opposite direction. It's going to go back towards the ventricles because it goes from high pressure to low pressure. And it's going to catch these cusps, and it's going to fill them with blood, and the valves will close because of the blood filling them. So when the aortic pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, semilunar valves will close. When ventricular pressure is greater than aortic pressure, it's going to push those valves open, and blood will be ejected from the heart. Okay? Does that make sense? Because this kind of thing is what we're going to be doing all morning. Okay? All right. Now, oh, I had another question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay. So, in this cycle, ventricular filling is where we started out here, okay? So this appearance, during this time, we have ventricular filling. What is required for ventricular filling? What valves have to be opened to allow I'm going to erase this if I may. So what valves have to be open to allow the ventricles to fill? The AV valves, okay? So that is a required assumption that when the AV valves are open, we have ventricular filling, okay? Then the atria contract. Obviously the valves are still open because when the ventricles contract, it's going to create a slightly higher pressure than we have in the ventricles. Then the ventricles are going to relax, and the atria are going to relax, and the ventricles are going to contract. As the ventricles start to contract, their pressure increases, and that's going to close the AV valves. All right, so if we look at our AV valves in this direction, increased ventricular pressure over atrial pressure is going to close the valve, whereas higher atrial pressure is going to open the valves. All right, so as ventricular pressure rises, it's going to close these valves. Now we have a situation at this time when the AV valves close. What position are the semilunar valves in? Are they open or closed? You can look at the picture for clues if you're not sure. They're still closed. Now, why do you think they're still closed? Exactly. There's not enough pressure where? In the ventricles to override the pressure in the aorta. So at this time now, we have both sets of valves are closed. The atrioventricular valves are closed, and the semilunar valves are closed. So this is known as isovolumetric. Iso meaning the same volume, so no change in volume. No blood is coming into the ventricles because the AV valves are closed. No blood is going out of the ventricles because the semilunar valves are closed. All right, the ventricles are still contracting. So pressure is rising very rapidly. And finally, the semilunar valves open. Okay? AV valves are still closed because ventricular pressure is still higher than atrial pressure. Obviously, it's getting higher and higher, so it's not going to fall below atrial pressure. And finally, it's higher than aortic pressure or pulmonary trunk pressure, and the semilunar valves open, and blood is ejected from the heart into the aorta and into the pulmonary trunk at the same time. So we call that the period of ventricular ejection. Both ventricles are pushing blood out of the heart into the great vessels. Then the ventricles repolarize and they relax. And as they're relaxing, pressure in the ventricles is dropping. Is it going to drop below aortic pressure first, or is it going to drop below atrial pressure first? Aortic. So as it drops below aortic pressure, now in the situation we were talking about earlier, aortic pressure is higher than ventricular pressure. It fills up those cusps, and the semilunar valves close. The AV valves are still closed because the ventricular pressure is still higher than the atria. And so we're back to another isovolumetric stage where blood is neither going out nor coming in. The ventricles continue to relax until pressure in the ventricles is below that in the atria, because blood's continuing to come into the atria. All right? And then AV valves open and we start filling again. That's the cardiac cycle. All right? This image, which you have in your lecture notes, shows these relationships along with the ECG. So that's what I want to diagram with you. Okay? On this diagram, we have three pressure relationships. The relationships, they're shown on the left side of the heart, between the left atrium and the left ventricle and the aorta. The same relationships would exist on the right side of the heart, but the pressure values would be lower. All right, because the right ventricle is not pumping with as much pressure. So the pressure in the pulmonary artery is going to be less, and their trunk is going to be less than the pressure in the aorta. All right, but the same relationships would exist. Anytime a pressure change reverses, and one pressure becomes higher or lower than the other, we say a change in the valve. And the valves will open or close. So we have 4 times where those occur. The one pressure changes in relationship to another. When the pressure changes between the atria and the ventricle, we have an atrioventricular valve opening or closing. That should make sense. Where the pressure changes between the aorta and the ventricle, we have the semilunar valve. The aortic semilunar valve opening or closing.
Where is that?
Up here, because here's the aortic pressure. All right. So on the exam, you will have a diagram like this, but it won't be labeled. All right, so I might ask you, what pressure is this? What pressure is this? What valve is opening or closing at this point? Okay? And it's there for you. All you have to do is interpret it. All right, so now let's go through and see what's happening. I've extended the PQ structure here just a wee bit. So we'll start out with atrial changes. So notice that the atrial pressure shown here in blue isn't changing very much. It rises and falls, and that's because most of the time during ventricular filling, which is most of our heart cycle, the blood flows right through the atria, passes through the AV valves and into the ventricles. And even the ventricular pressure doesn't change very much because the ventricles are stretching. Okay, if they stayed the same size, and we were trying to pack more in there, then pressure would increase, but it's stretching. So here we have, let's see if I can use the same colors you have on the board. So here we have ventricular pressure. We're kind of at this point here. So we see a slight rise, a very slight rise, not even that high. Now, the SA node fires. The current enters the atrial contractile cells, and they contract. And as a result, we have atrial contraction. And when that occurs, we see a slight rise in the atrial pressure because of the squeezing of the atrial walls. Okay. The ventricle, I'm going to use green for that one, the red one. Ventricular pressure, is that going to be higher or lower than atrial pressure while we have ventricular filling? It has to be lower. If it was higher, then blood wouldn't flow into the ventricles because it's not going to go up a pressure gradient, all right? So with ventricular pressure, it's going to mimic, it'll be slightly lower, it'll rise slightly when the atria contracts. Actually, I need to make this a little bit because I have a prolonged PQ interval here. And then the ventricle contracts as a result of the QRS, depolarization of the ventricles. So we have ventricular contraction. The QRS is showing depolarization, but as a result of that, ventricular contraction is going to follow. And so with ventricular contraction, I see a rise in my ventricular pressure. Okay, so let's stop there for a moment and let's put some summary over here. So when atrial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, what is the position of my AV valves, open or closed? Open. So my AV valve is going to be open. Okay, and that's what's occurring here. Atrial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, AV valves are open, and we have ventricular filling. Now let's reverse it. Ventricular pressure is greater than atrial pressure. What's going to happen to my AV valve? It's going to close. Okay. So it closes at the time the pressure becomes greater and it stays closed the entire time that ventricular pressure is greater than atrial pressure. All right? So again, to illustrate, the position of my AV valve is like this. When atrial pressure is greater, the valve opens. When ventricular pressure is greater, the valve closes. Okay? So at this point, right here, ventricular pressure has become greater than atrial pressure. So my AV valve closes. And it's the pressure, the ventricular pressure, that closes it. Does that make sense? Okay, just visualize that pressure pushing against the leaflets of the atrioventricular valve. This is happening on both the left side and the right side. We're diagramming the left side, but the same thing is happening at the same time on the left side. Okay? Now, the heart has been at rest. We don't have any ventricular ejection. So what is happening to aortic pressure this entire time as the last stroke volume is flowing away from the heart? What's going to be happening to the pressure in the aorta?
Increasing.
It's going to be dropping. All right, as that pressure is flowing away. So we have a dropping aortic pressure. And my ventricular pressure is rising. Now, while aortic pressure is dropping, are my semilunar valves open or closed? While my aortic pressure is dropping, are my semilunar valves going to be open or closed?
Open.
What's closing them? The fact that aortic pressure is higher than ventricular pressure. So this entire time, aortic pressure is higher than ventricular pressure. So my aortic valves are going to be closed. So at this point, when the AV valves close, both sets of valves are closed, right? Because these are already, semilunar valves are closed. Now my AV valve's closed. So as soon as my AV valve's closed, and before my semilunar valves open, during that short period of time, I am in isovolumetric state. Remember, all 4 valves are closed, no blood is coming in, no blood is leaving. So during that short period of time, I am in isovolumetric contraction. Since the semilunar valves are closed, my pressure rises very rapidly until it becomes greater than aortic pressure. As soon as it becomes greater than aortic pressure, remember my valves are shaped like this. So as soon as ventricular pressure becomes greater than aortic pressure, my valves are going to open. Okay? So if we write a similar relationship here, when aortic pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, my semilunar valves are closed. And when ventricular pressure is greater than aortic pressure, that's going to push the valves open. And my semilunar valves are open. Okay? So at this point, my semilunar valves open. And what's going to happen to the blood in my ventricle? It's going to go out into the aorta. Okay? That's what we call ventricular ejection. So as that occurs, ventricular pressure is still rising, and aortic pressure rises as well because more blood is going into the aorta. Okay? And so we have ventricular ejection. As long as the semilunar valves are open, we have ventricular ejection. As long as the atrioventricular valves were open, we had ventricular filling. Now, what happens to ventricular pressure? The ventricles start to repolarize, and the ventricles start to relax, and pressure starts to fall. So ventricular pressure is falling, and as a result, aortic pressure falls, and then ventricular pressure becomes less than aortic pressure. See right here. As a result of repolarization, the ventricles are relaxing. So now we have a flip in our ratio, and we're looking at this. Okay, aortic pressure is again greater than ventricular pressure. So our semilunar valves are going to open because ventricular pressure has dropped below. Our semilunar valves are going to close because aortic pressure is still higher, ventricular pressure has dropped, and so the blood flows back towards the ventricles, fills those cusps up, and closes them. Okay? Now, ventricular pressure continues to drop. In the meantime, our atrial pressure has risen slightly because the AV valves are closed. And ventricular pressure drops below atrial pressure as they completely relax. And what happens to the valve. AV valves will open. Okay, so you notice semilunar valves are the relationship between the ventricles and the aorta. Atrioventricular valves are the relationship between ventricles and the atria. Okay, so for this period of time, both as soon as the semilunar valves closed and before the AV valves open, we are again in a period of no volume change. So this is iso volumetric relaxation. Both sets of valves are closed. Because the semilunar valves will close before the AV valves open. Now the AV valves are open, and we start ventricular filling all over again. That's your cardiac cycle. It's a logical sequence of which side of the valve the pressure is the highest. Okay? So try figuring it out. If pressure is higher on one side of the valve than it is on the other, which way is that valve going to move? Okay? If you're not sure, or you don't understand why, then come back to the picture. Because this tells you everything at a glance. During ventricular filling, aortic pressure is highest, then atrial pressure, then ventricular pressure. You can see that. This is highest, this is next, ventricular pressure is the lowest. During ventricular filling, ventricular pressure is the highest, then aortic pressure, then atrial pressure. Okay, so you can see that relationship on the diagram, but I want you to understand it based on understanding. You're going to be able to figure it out because you understand it. So, which of the following conditions exist during isovolumetric relaxation? So just thinking about it, isovolumetric means which valves are closed, which valves are open. All the valves